History is full of brave explorers who push the boundaries of human achievement. This video is not about them. This is about the expeditions that went so spectacularly wrong, they make you wonder how humanity survived this long. We are talking about armies swallowed by deserts, explorers who packed dinner tables but forgot food, and balloonists who flew to the Arctic without knowing how to steer. From frozen wastelands to jungle nightmares, these are 33 expeditions that turned into absolute disasters, and honestly, some of them were doomed before they even started. 1. In 1904, Russia decided to send its Baltic fleet halfway around the world to fight Japan. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Literally everything. The journey began with the fleet opening fire on British fishing boats in the North Sea because someone panicked and thought the tiny trawlers were Japanese torpedo boats. In the North Sea, thousands of miles from Japan. Britain almost declared war over this. Then things got weirder. Sailors started collecting exotic animals at ports, including venomous snakes that escaped and bit people. Ships collided with each other. One vessel accidentally fired on another Russian ship during a drill. They lost boats, they lost crew members to bizarre accidents, and by the time they finally reached Japan, the fleet was exhausted and demoralized. The actual battle at Tsushima lasted about a day. Japan destroyed almost the entire Russian fleet. The voyage took 7 months. The defeat took hours. 2. In 1860, Robert Burke and William Wills set out to become the first Europeans to cross Australia from south to north. They had funding, supplies, and ambition. What they lacked was common sense. Their expedition included a heavy cedar dining table, because apparently you cannot explore a desert without proper furniture. They brought enough equipment for a small army, but somehow miscalculated their food supplies. Burke, impatient and terrible at leadership, split the group multiple times and pushed forward recklessly. When they finally reached the northern coast, they were already starving on the return journey. The rescue party that was supposed to wait for them left the designated meeting point just hours before Burke and Wills arrived. Hours. The two explorers eventually died under a tree called the Dig Tree, surrounded by Aboriginal people who tried to help them but were driven away by Burke's paranoia and gunshots. They starved to death in a land where locals had thrived for thousands of years. 3. In 1897, Swedish engineer Salomon August André had a brilliant idea. Why walk to the North Pole when you can just float there in a hydrogen balloon? The plan had one tiny flaw. André had almost no experience actually steering the balloon he designed. The drag ropes that were supposed to help control direction fell off almost immediately after launch. So there they were, 3 Swedish men drifting over the Arctic with zero navigation ability, relying entirely on wind currents and optimism. The balloon lost hydrogen faster than expected and crashed onto the ice after just 3 days. The trio survived the landing and began walking south across the frozen wasteland. They hauled supplies, shot polar bears for food, and kept detailed journals. 3 months later, all 3 were dead on a remote island. The exact cause remains debated, but eating undercooked polar bear meat, which carries deadly parasites, probably did not help. Their bodies were not found until 1930, perfectly preserved by the cold. 4. Maurice Wilson was an English soldier who survived World War I and emerged with a mystical belief that fasting and faith could accomplish anything. Anything included climbing Mount Everest. Alone, with no mountaineering experience whatsoever. His plan was simple. Fly a small plane to Tibet, crash-land it on the slopes of Everest, then walk to the summit powered by prayer and spiritual discipline. The British government tried to stop him, banning him from flying over Nepal and Everest. Wilson ignored them, secretly flew to India, trekked to Tibet in disguise, and began his solo ascent in 1934. He made it to about 7,000 meters before the mountain did what mountains do. He froze to death in his tent, his diary recording increasingly desperate entries about exhaustion and frostbite. His body was found a year later by a legitimate expedition. They buried him in a crevasse. The glacier has since moved, and climbers occasionally report seeing his remains emerge from the ice. He is still up there, still not at the summit. 5. Sir Walter Raleigh was obsessed with El Dorado, the legendary city of gold supposedly hidden somewhere in South America. He first went looking in 1595, found nothing but jungle and disappointment, and came home with wild stories. King James I was not impressed but gave Raleigh another chance in 1617, with strict orders not to engage Spanish forces. Raleigh, desperate and aging, sent his son Wat on a raiding party that attacked a Spanish outpost. Wat was killed in the fighting. The raid produced no gold, only a diplomatic disaster with Spain. When Raleigh returned to England empty-handed, having lost his son and broken his promise to the king, his fate was sealed. He was arrested and beheaded in 1618, partly to smooth things over with Spain. His wife reportedly kept his embalmed head in a velvet bag for the rest of her life, all because of a city that never existed, a golden mirage that cost him absolutely everything. 6. In February 1959, 9 Soviet students went hiking in the northern Ural Mountains. They were experienced, well-equipped, and following a planned route. None of them came back. When search parties found their tent weeks later, it had been sliced open from the inside. The students had fled into freezing temperatures without proper clothing or shoes. Their bodies were scattered across the mountainside. Some died of hypothermia, which made sense. Others had massive internal injuries, crushed ribs and fractured skulls, but no external wounds, which made no sense at all. One woman was missing her tongue and eyes. Soviet investigators officially blamed an unknown compelling force and closed the case. Theories have ranged from avalanches to secret military tests to infrasound-induced panic to, yes, even aliens. The Russian government reopened the investigation in 2019 and concluded it was probably an avalanche. Many researchers disagree. Whatever happened on Dyatlov Pass that night remains one of history's most chilling unsolved mysteries. 7. In the 1690s, Scotland decided to become a colonial empire. The target was Darien, a strip of land in Panama that would connect Atlantic and Pacific trade routes. It sounded brilliant on paper. Scotland invested roughly a quarter of its entire national wealth into this venture. Thousands of colonists sailed to Central America with high hopes and terrible preparation. What they found was a swampy, disease-ridden jungle where malaria killed faster than anyone could build shelters. The Spanish, who actually controlled the region, were not thrilled about Scottish neighbors. Supply ships never arrived. English colonies were forbidden from helping. Within 2 years, the colony was abandoned and Scotland was financially devastated. The Darien scheme bankrupted the nation so completely that it directly led to the Act of Union in 1707, when Scotland merged with England partly just to pay off the massive debts. One disastrous expedition in Panama essentially ended Scottish independence. That is impressively catastrophic, even by expedition standards. 8. In 1212, thousands of young people across France and Germany became convinced that they could succeed where adult crusaders had failed. The idea was that their innocence and faith would part the seas and allow them to peacefully convert Muslims and reclaim Jerusalem. No armies needed, just pure childlike devotion. The reality was a nightmare. Most of these children never made it past the Alps, dying from cold, starvation, and disease in the mountain passes. Those who reached Mediterranean ports expecting miracles found only opportunistic merchants. According to various accounts, many were tricked onto ships and sold into slavery in North Africa. Others simply disappeared into history, their fates unrecorded. Some historians debate whether the participants were actually children or simply poor peasants, since the Latin word used could mean either. But the outcome remains the same. Thousands of desperate, idealistic young people marched toward certain doom, manipulated by prophecy and abandoned by the adults who should have stopped them. The seas never parted. 9. The Franklin expedition of 1845 was supposed to be the triumph of British naval superiority. Sir John Franklin commanded 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, packed with the latest technology. Steam engines, iron-reinforced hulls, a library, a piano, and enough tinned food to last years. They were going to finally chart the Northwest Passage through Arctic Canada. Instead, they vanished. Both ships became trapped in ice near King William Island. What happened next unfolded over years. The canned food, sealed with lead solder, was slowly poisoning the crew. Scurvy and starvation set in. Franklin died in 1847, and the remaining men eventually abandoned ship and tried to walk south. They never made it. Inuit witnesses reported seeing desperate men dragging boats across ice, some of them going mad. Forensic evidence from remains confirms lead poisoning and, more disturbingly, cannibalism. The bones show clear cut marks from knives. Over 100 men with the best equipment of their era, reduced to eating each other in the frozen dark. Both ships were finally found in 2014 and 2016, sitting silently on the ocean floor. 10. Alexander the Great never lost a battle. But the Gedrosian Desert nearly destroyed his army without a single enemy soldier. In 325 BC, after conquering most of the known world, Alexander decided to march his army home through the brutal Makran Desert in what is now southern Pakistan and Iran. Why? Partly logistics, but mostly ego. The legendary Persian king Cyrus the Great had supposedly lost an army in this same desert centuries earlier. Alexander wanted to prove he could succeed where Cyrus had failed. He was wrong. The 60-day march became a death sentence. Temperatures soared during the day and plummeted at night. Water sources were almost non-existent. Soldiers drank from muddy pools and died from contaminated water. Flash floods swept through camps at night, drowning exhausted men in their sleep. Baggage animals collapsed and were eaten raw. Historians estimate Alexander lost between 40,000 and 80,000 people, possibly 75% of the force that entered the desert. More casualties than any battle he ever fought. All because one man could not resist a challenge from a king who had been dead for 2 centuries. 11. Soyuz. 11 was a triumph of Soviet space engineering until the final 15 minutes. In June 1971, cosmonauts Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev successfully docked with Salyut 1, the world's first space station. They spent 23 days conducting experiments, a new record for human spaceflight. Everything went perfectly. The return journey began normally. The crew reported feeling fine as they separated from the station. Then silence. Ground control received no response during descent. The capsule's parachute deployed correctly. It landed softly in the Kazakhstan steppe. Recovery teams opened the hatch to cheering cosmonauts, heroes of the Soviet space program. Instead, they found 3 men still strapped in their seats, motionless. They had been dead for about 30 minutes. A small ventilation valve had opened accidentally during the separation sequence, depressurizing the cabin. In the vacuum of space, the crew lost consciousness within seconds and died shortly after. They were not wearing spacesuits because the capsule was too small for suited cosmonauts. 3 men who had survived the longest space mission in history were killed by a valve the size of a coin. 12. In 1527, Pánfilo de Narváez landed in Florida with roughly 600 Spanish colonists and dreams of gold. Within a year, almost everyone was dead. The expedition was cursed from the start. Narváez immediately made enemies of local tribes, got separated from his supply ships, and decided to march inland through swamps and forests without adequate food or navigation. Men died from disease, starvation, and Native American attacks. The survivors built crude rafts and tried to sail along the Gulf Coast to Mexico. Storms destroyed most of the rafts. Narváez himself disappeared at sea, still giving orders as his raft drifted into darkness. Of the original 600, only 4 men survived, including Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who spent the next 8 years wandering across the American Southwest. These survivors lived among various Native American tribes, sometimes as slaves, sometimes as respected healers. They walked naked through deserts, ate prickly pear cactus, and eventually stumbled into Spanish Mexico in 1536. Cabeza de Vaca wrote a book about the experience. It remains one of the most bizarre survival stories in history. 13. In 1820, the American whaling ship Essex was hunting sperm whales in the Pacific Ocean when something unprecedented happened. A whale fought back. An enormous sperm whale, estimated at 85 feet long, rammed the Essex twice deliberately, sinking the ship. The 21 crew members escaped in 3 small whaleboats with minimal supplies. Here is where it gets worse. Instead of sailing to nearby Polynesian islands, which they feared were full of cannibals, the crew decided to sail toward South America, over 3,000 miles away. The irony would become grotesque. As weeks turned to months, the starving sailors began dying. The survivors faced an impossible choice. They drew lots. The losers were killed and eaten by their crewmates. When rescue finally came, only 8 men remained alive. Delirious and surrounded by human bones, they had been too weak to throw overboard. First mate Owen Chase survived and wrote his account, which Herman Melville read before writing Moby Dick. The fictional whale only destroyed 1 ship. The real whale destroyed 21 men's lives and created a horror story worse than any fiction. 14. In June 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Russia with roughly 600,000 soldiers, the largest army Europe had ever seen. 6 months later, fewer than 100,000 stumbled back out. Many historians consider it the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. The Russians refused to fight the decisive battle Napoleon wanted. Instead, they retreated, burning crops and villages behind them, leaving nothing for the French to eat. Napoleon captured Moscow in September, but the city was deliberately set ablaze by its own residents. He waited 5 weeks for a Russian surrender that never came. Then winter arrived. The retreat became a frozen death march. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees. Horses died by the thousands, which meant no cavalry and no way to pull supply wagons. Soldiers froze, standing up. Others were picked off by Cossack raiders or Russian partisans. Men ate their own boots and saddle leather. The grand army that had conquered Europe dissolved into skeletal survivors, shuffling through snowdrifts. By December, it was over. Napoleon abandoned his army and raced back to Paris to raise new troops, leaving behind a frozen monument to imperial overreach. 15. The Belgian Antarctic expedition of 1897 was supposed to be a scientific voyage. It became a psychological horror story. Under Commander Adrien de Gerlache, the ship Belgica sailed south and deliberately pushed into pack ice, seeking glory. The ice had other plans. It trapped the ship, and the Belgica drifted helplessly for 13 months, becoming the first expedition to survive an Antarctic winter. Survive is generous. As the polar night descended, months of complete darkness drove men to the edge of madness. Symptoms included depression, paranoia, hallucinations, and a strange condition where men could not remember simple tasks. One sailor became convinced that the ice was alive and plotting against them. The cook went catatonic. Even the ship's cat became aggressive and disturbed. The hero was Dr. Frederick Cook, who recognized the crew was developing scurvy and something resembling seasonal depression. He forced everyone to eat raw penguin and seal meat, and he made men stand in front of open fires for light therapy. Cook essentially invented a treatment for polar madness on the spot. When spring finally came and the ice released them, most of the crew was alive but permanently changed. 16. Colonel Percy Fawcett was a decorated British explorer, a veteran of multiple Amazon expeditions, and completely convinced that a lost ancient city he called Z was hidden somewhere in the Brazilian jungle. In 1925, at age 57, Fawcett launched his final expedition to find it. He brought only his eldest son Jack and Jack's best friend Raleigh Rymel, believing a small group could move faster and attract less attention. They sent their last communication from a place called Dead Horse Camp at the edge of unexplored territory. Then nothing. No further letters, no remains, no traces. The jungle simply swallowed them whole. Over the decades, more than 100 people have died trying to find out what happened to Fawcett. Some tribes in the region have stories about 3 white men who entered their territory. Various theories suggest they were killed by indigenous people, died of disease, or even chose to stay and live with the tribe. No definitive answer has ever emerged. Fawcett wanted to find a city lost to time. Instead, he became one of history's most famous disappearances, proof that the Amazon keeps its secrets. 17. HMS Bounty sailed from England in 1787 with a simple mission: collect breadfruit plants from Tahiti and transport them to Caribbean colonies as cheap food for enslaved workers. The voyage out took 10 months. The crew spent 5 months in Tahiti waiting for the plants to mature. That was the problem. Tahiti in the 1780s was paradise compared to brutal life at sea. Warm weather, fresh food, friendly locals, and romantic relationships. When Captain William Bligh finally ordered departure, his crew had no interest in leaving. 3 weeks later, Fletcher Christian led a mutiny. Bligh and 18 loyal men were set adrift in a small open boat with minimal supplies. Here is the incredible part. Bligh navigated that boat over 6,500 kilometers across open ocean to safety in Timor, using only a pocket watch and his memory of charts. It remains one of the greatest feats of navigation in maritime history. The mutineers eventually settled on remote Pitcairn Island, where their descendants still live today. Bligh survived, returned to England, and even commanded another successful breadfruit expedition. The man was genuinely unsinkable, even if his crew despised him. 18. In 524 BC, Persian King Cambyses II had already conquered Egypt when he decided that was not enough. He dispatched an army of 50,000 soldiers across the Sahara Desert to destroy the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, which had apparently insulted him by questioning his legitimacy. According to the ancient historian Herodotus, the army marched into the desert and was never seen again. Halfway to their destination, a massive sandstorm supposedly engulfed them. All 50,000 men simply vanished beneath the dunes. For over 2,000 years, archaeologists and treasure hunters have searched for the lost army of Cambyses. Occasional claims of discovery have surfaced, bronze weapons here, human bones there, but nothing definitively confirmed. Modern Egyptologists debate whether the army ever existed at that size or whether Herodotus exaggerated a smaller force. But the desert is vast, and sand buries everything eventually. Somewhere under the Sahara, there might still be 50,000 Persian soldiers waiting to be found. Or the whole story could be ancient propaganda. The desert keeps its secrets even better than the jungle. 19. In 1912, Douglas Mawson led an Australian Antarctic expedition that became one of history's most brutal survival stories. During a sledging journey, his companion Belgrave Ninnis fell into a crevasse along with a dog team and most of their food supplies. The fall was so deep, Mawson could hear the surviving dogs whimpering but could see nothing. There was no rescue possible. Mawson and his remaining companion, Xavier Mertz, turned back with almost no food and 300 miles to cover. They ate their remaining sled dogs, including the livers. This was a fatal mistake. Dog liver contains toxic levels of vitamin A. Mertz deteriorated rapidly, becoming delirious, losing skin and sheets, and eventually dying. Mawson pushed on alone, also suffering from vitamin poisoning. His skin peeled off, his hair fell out, and the soles of his feet literally separated from the flesh beneath. He bandaged them back on with cloth and kept walking. When he finally reached base camp, his ship had departed just hours earlier. He spent another winter in Antarctica, waiting for rescue. Against all biological reason, Douglas Mawson survived. He was later knighted and lived until 1958. 20. The 1841 Niger expedition was Victorian Britain at its most confidently disastrous. The mission was to sail up the Niger River, sign treaties with African leaders, establish legitimate trade, and generally spread Christian civilization. 3 state-of-the-art iron steamships were built specifically for this purpose, equipped with experimental ventilation systems designed to prevent tropical diseases. The designers were very proud of their ventilation systems. Malaria did not care about ventilation systems. Within 2 months of entering the river, the expedition was devastated. Of the 150 Europeans aboard, 130 contracted fever. 54 died. The death rate was so catastrophic that crews became too sick to operate the ships. At one point, a geologist was commanding a vessel because all the actual naval officers were either dead or delirious. The ships retreated downriver in chaos. African crew members, who had natural resistance to local diseases, kept the vessels functioning while watching Europeans collapse around them. The expedition proved absolutely nothing about civilizing missions, but demonstrated spectacularly that tropical diseases did not respect technological arrogance. 21. In May 1928, the Italian airship Italia flew over the North Pole successfully. Then, on the return journey, it crashed onto the pack ice. The crash killed 1 crew member instantly and threw several others, along with supplies, onto the ice. Then the damaged airship, suddenly lighter, drifted away with 6 more men still aboard. They were never seen again. The survivors on the ice included expedition leader Umberto Nobili, who was injured in the crash. They salvaged a radio and, against incredible odds, managed to repair it. For weeks, they broadcast distress signals that no one seemed to hear. They dyed their tent red with smoke markers to be visible from the air. Eventually, a Soviet amateur radio enthusiast picked up their signal 100 to 200 miles away. The rescue effort that followed was massive and international, but it claimed its own victims. The great Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, who had beaten Scott to the South Pole and flown over the Arctic himself, joined the search. His plane disappeared over the Barents Sea. Amundsen's body was never found. The Italia disaster killed more rescuers than original survivors. 22. In 1540, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led one of the largest expeditions in North American history, searching for the 7 cities of Cibola, which Native American rumors described as practically paved with gold. He departed Mexico with over 300 Spanish soldiers, 1,000 indigenous allies, and massive herds of livestock. For 2 years, they wandered through what is now the American Southwest and Great Plains, looking for cities that did not exist. What they actually found was the Zuni Pueblo of Hawiku, made of adobe mud, with no gold whatsoever. The Spanish attacked anyway. They found the Grand Canyon and were annoyed by it because they could not cross. They met Plains Indians and chased stories of another golden kingdom called Quivira, which turned out to be grass huts in Kansas. Throughout this pointless wandering, Coronado's forces committed atrocities against indigenous peoples, burning villages and executing resistors. By 1542, the expedition returned to Mexico broke, disgraced, and with nothing to show for years of searching except a trail of destruction. Coronado was later tried for his failures and war crimes, though he was mostly acquitted. 23. The Canadian Arctic expedition of 1913 was doomed the moment Vilhjalmur Stephenson took command. The expedition ship Karluk became trapped in ice off the Alaska coast. Stephenson's response was to leave the ship with a small hunting party, supposedly for a 10-day trip. He never came back. He simply walked ashore and continued his exploring career while his crew faced disaster without him. The Karluk drifted helplessly for months before the ice finally crushed it in January 1914. Captain Robert Bartlett led the stranded crew across the frozen sea to Wrangel Island. This was survival at its most desperate. Temperatures reached -50 degrees. Men died from exposure, from eating bad meat, and in one case, possibly from murder, though the circumstances remained suspicious. Others simply walked onto the ice and never returned. Bartlett eventually trekked to Siberia and organized a rescue that saved the remaining survivors. 11 of the Karluk's 25 crew members died. Stephenson, meanwhile, faced no consequences. He wrote books, gave lectures, and blamed everyone else for the disaster. He lived until 1962, reputation largely intact. 24. In 1717, Peter the Great of Russia sent Prince Alexander Bekovich Cherkassky with approximately 4,000 troops to find gold in Central Asia and establish trade routes with India through the Khanate of Khiva in modern Uzbekistan. The expedition crossed hundreds of miles of desert, losing men to heat and thirst, before finally reaching Khivan territory. The Khan of Khiva, Shergazi, seemed welcoming. Too welcoming. He explained that such a large force could not be fed and housed together, so he suggested splitting the Russians into smaller groups distributed among various settlements for hospitality. Bekovich, apparently having never heard of basic military precautions, agreed. On a prearranged night, Khivan forces attacked all the scattered Russian camps simultaneously. It was a coordinated massacre. Nearly everyone was killed, including Bekovich himself, who was reportedly skinned alive. The few survivors who made it back to Russia numbered somewhere between 2 and 40, depending on which account you believe. The Khan sent Peter the Great a message politely declining further contact. The expedition had walked directly into one of history's most obvious traps. 25. The USS Jeannette departed San Francisco in 1879 to find the North Pole via an optimistic theory that warm Pacific currents created an ice-free sea around the pole. This was completely wrong. The ship became trapped in pack ice near Siberia and drifted helplessly for nearly 2 years. When the ice finally crushed the Jeannette in June 1881, the 33-man crew hauled supplies in small boats across the frozen sea toward the Siberian coast. The march was brutal. Frostbite, starvation, and exhaustion killed men steadily. When they finally reached open water, the 3 boats were separated by storms. One boat vanished completely with 8 men aboard. Commander George DeLong's boat landed on the Siberian coast, but in an empty region with no help. DeLong and his men slowly starved to death while waiting for rescue that never came. His journal entries become increasingly sparse and desperate. The final entry simply reads, "Mr. Collins dying." Search parties found DeLong's body the following spring, his hand raised above the ice, still clutching his records. He had protected the ship's log with his last conscious act. 26. Mungo Park was a Scottish explorer who became famous for his first expedition to trace the Niger River in the 1790s. That journey was horrific, involving enslavement, disease, and robbery, but Park survived and wrote a best-selling book. So naturally, he went back. The second expedition in 1805 was supposed to be better funded and better organized. It was neither. Park departed with approximately 40 Europeans. By the time they reached the Niger River, only 11 remained alive, the rest killed by dysentery, malaria, and exhaustion. Park pressed on with his diminishing crew, building a makeshift boat and sailing downstream. He was last seen alive at Bussa Rapids in November 1805. What happened next comes from local accounts collected years later. According to these reports, Park's boat was attacked by indigenous warriors at a narrow point in the river. Refusing to surrender or negotiate, Park and his remaining men jumped into the rapids rather than be captured. They all drowned. Not a single member of the expedition survived. Park had traveled thousands of miles just to drown within sight of his goal, having learned nothing from his first near-death experience. 27. In 1872, the Austro-Hungarian Empire decided it also wanted a piece of Arctic exploration glory. The Dyatlov expedition, led by Julius Payer and Karl Weiprecht, sailed north from Norway looking for a northeast passage to Asia. They found ice instead. The ship became trapped in September 1872, and it stayed trapped. For months, the Dyatlov drifted northward, carried by currents and locked into the pack ice. The crew could do nothing but wait, ration supplies, and hope. Then, in August 1873, land appeared through the fog. They had accidentally discovered an entire archipelago that no European had ever seen, a cluster of 191 islands they named Franz Josef Land after their emperor. Over the following months, Payer led sledge expeditions across the frozen islands, mapping and naming features. But the ship remained stuck. By May 1874, Weiprecht made the difficult decision to abandon the Dyatlov entirely. The crew hauled boats across the ice for 3 months before finally reaching open water. They rowed and sailed to Novaya Zemlya, where Russian fishermen rescued them. They had been gone for over 2 years and discovered an archipelago by accident, simply because their frozen prison drifted into it. 28. Ludwig Leichhardt was a Prussian naturalist who came to Australia and somehow became one of its most celebrated explorers, despite a tendency for getting catastrophically lost. His 1844 expedition from Brisbane to Port Essington took 14 months instead of 5 and lost most of its supplies, but he survived, became famous, and started planning bigger things. In 1848, Leichhardt launched his most ambitious expedition, a transcontinental crossing from east to west, approximately 4,500 kilometers of mostly unknown territory. He departed with 6 men, 50 bullocks, and supreme confidence. They were last seen at a station on the Darling Downs in April 1848. Then nothing. No trace, no bodies, no equipment, no messages. It was as if the Australian interior simply swallowed them whole. Search parties over the following decades found tantalizing hints: trees with possible carved initials, Aboriginal stories of white men dying in the desert, fragments of equipment that might or might not have been theirs. But nothing definitive has ever been found. Leichhardt remains Australia's greatest exploration mystery, a man who walked into the outback and became a ghost. 29. In June 1924, George Mallory and Andrew Irvine departed their high camp on Mount Everest and climbed toward the summit. A fellow climber watching through a telescope saw them high on the mountain, going strong, before clouds swallowed them forever. Neither man returned. The question of whether Mallory and Irvine reached the summit before dying has haunted mountaineering for a century. Mallory was the experienced climber, famous for saying he wanted to climb Everest because it's there. Irvine was young and brilliant with the expedition's primitive oxygen equipment. They climbed in wool and tweed, using technology that would be considered suicidal today. In 1999, a search expedition found Mallory's body at 8,185 meters. He lay face down, arms extended as if trying to arrest a fall, his clothing shredded by decades of wind. His body showed injuries consistent with a falling accident. But was he ascending or descending when he fell? Irvine's body and, crucially, the camera he carried have never been found. That camera might contain photographs proving they reached the summit in 1924, 29 years before Hillary and Tenzing. The mountain keeps its secrets. 30. Henry Morton Stanley was already famous for finding Dr. Livingstone when he launched the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition in 1886. Emin Pasha was a German-born governor trapped in southern Sudan by the Mahdist rebellion. Stanley would march across Central Africa and rescue him. What followed was not so much a rescue as an armed invasion. Stanley chose the most difficult route possible, straight through the Ituri rainforest, where his massive column of over 700 men faced disease, starvation, and constant attacks. Porters died by the hundreds. Stanley's officers committed atrocities against local villages to obtain food. The rear column, left behind to guard supplies, descended into murder, torture, and alleged cannibalism under its deranged commander. When Stanley finally reached Emin Pasha after years of marching, the governor was not particularly enthusiastic about being rescued. He was doing fine, actually. He had supplies, authority, and no desire to leave. Stanley essentially bullied him into accepting rescue. At a celebration dinner afterward, Emin Pasha fell off a balcony and nearly died. The expedition that killed hundreds to save one man almost killed that man at the welcome party. 31. Otto Nordenskjöld led a Swedish expedition to Antarctica in 1901 that went wrong in almost every possible way and somehow ended with everyone alive. The expedition ship Antarctic dropped Nordenskjöld's shore party on Snow Hill Island, then sailed away to explore before winter. It never returned for pickup. The Antarctic became trapped in ice, then crushed and sank in February 1903. Now there were 3 separate groups stranded in Antarctica, with no idea if the others were alive. Nordenskjöld's original party, a relief party that had been dropped to search for them, and the crew of the sunken ship. For months, these groups survived independently in conditions that ranged from miserable to deadly. They built stone huts, ate penguin and seal constantly, and endured Antarctic winter without knowing if rescue would ever come. The crew of the Antarctic had marched across sea ice to Paulet Island, where they built a stone shelter that still exists today. One man died from a heart condition. Everyone else somehow survived until November 1903, when an Argentine naval corvette arrived and, through almost miraculous coincidence, managed to locate all 3 groups within days. The relief that ship crew must have felt remains unimaginable. 32. Richard Burton and John Hanning Speke were 2 of Victorian England's most famous explorers and also its most bitter rivals. In 1857, they set out together from Zanzibar to find the source of the Nile River, one of geography's great remaining mysteries. The expedition was a masterpiece of suffering. Both men contracted multiple diseases. Burton became so ill he could barely walk. Speke developed an infection that left him temporarily blind and deaf. They fought constantly about decisions and methods. When they finally reached Lake Tanganyika, both were too sick to properly explore it. On the return journey, Speke made a side trip to another large lake he named Victoria and declared it the Nile's source. Burton disagreed violently. The scientific dispute became a personal war that lasted years. Both men published competing accounts, gave rival lectures, and attacked each other in the press. In September 1864, they were scheduled to debate their claims publicly at a scientific conference. The day before the debate, Speke died from a gunshot wound while hunting. The official verdict was accidental death. Many suspected suicide. Some whispered about murder. The truth went to the grave with Speke, along with any hope of reconciliation. 33. Robert Falcon. Scott reached the South Pole on January 17, 1912, only to find that Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen had beaten him there by 34 days. "Great God, this is an awful place," Scott wrote in his journal, standing next to the Norwegian flag. The journey home would kill him. Scott's expedition had relied on ponies and man-hauling sledges rather than dog teams. This decision proved fatal. The return march across 800 miles of Antarctic ice was slower than planned. Frostbite took hold. Edgar Evans died first, likely from a combination of injuries and hypothermia. Lawrence Oates, his feet destroyed by frostbite, famously walked out of the tent into a blizzard saying, "I am just going outside and maybe some time." He never returned. Scott, Edward Wilson, and Henry Bowers made it to within 11 miles of a supply depot before a blizzard pinned them down. They lay in their tent for 9 days as food and fuel ran out. Scott's final journal entry, dated March 29, 1912, reads, "It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. For God's sake, look after our people." Their frozen bodies were found 8 months later, the tent half buried in snow. So there you have it. 33 expeditions where ambition collided with reality, and reality won decisively. Some of these disasters came from arrogance, some from bad luck, some from decisions so baffling they still confuse historians today. But here's the question that really gets me. If you had to join one of these doomed expeditions, which would you choose? The one with the dining table in the desert? The balloon with no steering? The army walking into an obvious trap? Tell me in the comments which disaster you would risk and why. If this journey through catastrophe entertained you, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. More unbelievable history is coming soon.